Consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. On this episode of the What is Asia podcast, I have the great honor of being able to say I interviewed two esteemed scholars. The first is Michael Nylan, a professor of Chinese history, and the other is Carlos Noreña, a professor of Roman history, both at the University of California at Berkeley. In this interview, we talk about their research comparing Western Han Chang'an with early Imperial Rome, as well as stereotypes of academia and the importance of studying ancient history. Dr. Nylan, Dr. Noreña, thank you for coming on this episode of the What is Asia podcast.
Do call me Michael. Okay.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So I was really interested in contacting both of you and talking about your research because you have worked on this project that I don't think really many people have thought that much about before, which is comparing the ancient Han city of Chang'an and early Imperial Rome. So, Michael, I'd like to start with you. For people, many of the people in my audience are American, and many of them don't have that much familiarity with China, much less ancient China. What is Chang'an? Can you talk about other aspects of it, like who founded it? Do we know who the principal architects behind the city were? How was it? How is the building of the city funded? And also, if we could think about the historical context around the how and why of the founding of the city. So I know I've thrown a lot at you, but there's a few different things that you can chew on there.
Let me begin with everything you asked is very complicated. Chang'an was built on the foundations of an earlier capital, Shenyang, the capital of the first unifying empire in China, circa 221 BC. And the capital got too big to hold its people. And so it started to build south of the river. The original capital was north of the river. And what happened was the Qing Dynasty was a short-lived dynasty, and it fell before they could build the planned palaces south of the Wei River. When you build in what's called rammed earth, this is incredibly labor-intensive. You do this if you don't have a lot of stone around, which is true of the North China Plain. And so you literally go like this, you tamp the earth until it becomes as hard as stone. So they already had all these foundations that were supposed to be another palace extravaganza out in the middle of a hunting field. So a kind of satellite series of palaces. And that's where they built Chang'an. And the name of Chang'an is itself significant here. It means eternal or long-lasting peace and security. So as opposed to the Qin, they would build on the old Qin foundations, use what was there before, and grow an empire that would provide long-lasting security, both for the ruling line and for the subjects of that empire. So we don't know who the principal architects were, but we know in the middle of the wars of transition through which the Qin fell and the Han arose, that they were spending just as much on building these palaces as they were on funding the war. And that they saw building these magnificent palatial structures as a kind of soft power, if you will. They would rise up from the level plain and people would be awestruck that this group of people in the middle of conducting a war had full aspirations and confidence that they would become the next reigning dynasty. So we know who said these funds had to be spent this way, and it was Xiaohe, the brains behind the founder of the Han Dynasty, okay? And he was running everything about funding the war, advertising the virtues of the Han founder. And this was his quite cold calculation that he would get more out of palatial buildings than he would get out of an extra battalion of the army. So he did get more out of it. Liu Bang was the only contender, a commoner himself, the first commoner emperor to reign in China, the first commoner king to reign in China. And everybody was scratching their heads at Xiaohe's calculation. He himself said, "What are you doing? I need more men." And Xiaohe said, "No, you need to think beyond the immediate to what will prove impressive to the subject population, so that you don't have to coerce them into allegiance. They want to be allied with you." So that's how Chang'an got founded. It was magnificent from the beginning, but over the 200 years when it was principal capital, it only got more magnificent, more palaces, more jade hangings, more silk, more antiquities filling up the palaces, more manuscripts filling up the palaces. I'm interested both in Chang'an, but I'm interested in a very particular time in Chang'an, which matches Carlos's project very well, because I'm interested in a reign that is usually ignored, where many of the most impressive achievements of the Han Dynasty occurred, and the three smartest people who ever lived in the Han, Western or Eastern, were all laboring on behalf of that court to make it as magnificent and culturally impressive as possible. So I focus in on 27 BCE, because that's when a magnificent library project was built. 26 BCE, because of course Augustus comes to rule in Rome in 27 BC. So it's exactly comparable in time. So the splendors of the two places can be seen if we gather the information relating to these splendors. So let me just give a background. One reason to compare, and I know Carlos will also speak to this, one reason to compare these two antique empires was they ruled over almost exactly the same amount of territory, almost exactly the same number of registered tax-paying people. They were the two largest cities in the antique world. Okay, Rome maybe as many as 1 million, Han Chang'an definitely at a minimum 1.2 million people. And they ran their empires under the same more or less technological conditions, and they could not have run them more differently. So that's what got us interested in doing this. How do you run a successful empire on completely different premises? So I hope that leads into Carlos. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Carlos, you want to add anything right there?
No. I can pick up from whatever the next question will be.
Okay.
So Professor Noreña, this leads very well into the question that I have for you. So when many people hear that you worked on research comparing Western Han Chang'an and Imperial Rome, they may be skeptical that there's any value in comparing these two very different cities. outside the fact that they're both notable ancient urban centers. However, you note that you're comparing two specific points in these cities' histories. So what two periods are these, if you could give a little more context? And why did you choose these two particular time periods in particular? And as an extension to this question, you pointedly note in the article about this topic that, and I quote, "The cityscapes of Western Han Chang'an and early Imperial Rome, however different they may look on the surface, may both be read as concrete expressions of monarchic authority." There's a lot to unpack there. What exactly do you mean by that?
Sure, thank you. No, that's a great set of questions. And let me take them a little bit in turn. Michael's already begun to sketch a response to a question that any historian undertaking comparative work needs to wrestle with, which is not only why compare at all, and we can talk about that, but once you've gotten into a comparative orientation, what is the basis for any one comparison? So it's true that ancient Rome and ancient Chang'an are, as you call them, notable ancient cities, but I think they're more than that, because they're both the centers of power, political, economic, and cultural and administrative, of these two large imperial systems. And they're both so much more concentrations of power than other urban settlements in their midst that they're kind of qualitatively different. So it's not as if you're comparing a capital city with merely a big city or a small town or a village. Those comparisons might flounder a bit on the lack of comparability. But here we're looking at two capitals of these great world empires. So there's built in a kind of elementary comparability there. Now, you do raise another important question for any historian, but for a comparative historian as well. Which period do you look at? Because these are cities that have very long histories. So the city of Rome, for example, we can trace through the archaeology the earliest inhabitation of the city to about 1000 BCE. The ancient tradition that the Romans themselves generated on their own history was that the city had been formally founded in the middle of the 8th century BCE. And that is also when the archaeology begins to show a real uptick in activity. And then the city lasts, in fact, till the present day. So even deciding what counts as ancient can be problematic. But for a question like this, then you simply have to choose a moment, again, looking towards historical interest and comparability. On the Rome side, most of the study that you mentioned focuses on the period from the middle of the 1st century BCE up through, let's say, the middle of the 1st century CE. So it's a little bit longer stretch of time than the phase that Michael has focused on for Chang'an. It's characterized in Rome by having undergone a significant historical transition in the government of the city of Rome, which for hundreds of years had been ruled as a republic, which means in practice that the Roman people or the Roman citizen body was sovereign, and there were various mechanisms of institutional decision-making to give voice to the people. Not quite a democracy on my reading, but not too far from that either. But that whole system in the 1st century BCE collapses in a series of civil wars, and it is replaced by, in effect, the last warlord standing, who we now remember as the first Emperor Augustus, who establishes a hereditary monarchy in place of the Republic. So it's a period of real change and transition in the city of Rome, but it's also one that correlates with a high degree of monumentalization. So the Rome of the imagination, the great monuments that we think of in ancient Rome, many of them are built in this period. So I sort of chose it as a moment of greatest activity and energy. which is similar, I think, to what's happening in Chang'an. Of course, one could do interesting different kinds of work on periods of decline, for example, but we chose periods of kind of robust energy. Now, the quote you read out speaks to another important aspect of comparative history, which is what it is you're looking for. I think Michael and I have both felt that maybe too much comparative history is aimed at generating simple, and we think superficial, lists of similarities and differences. And one of the things that we've been after is trying to get beneath that level to deeper structures. And this comparison set that up nicely, because if you look at a map or images of Chang'an in 26 BCE or Rome at the same period, everything that leaps off the page is different. Chang'an is a city of palaces mainly, dominated by these gigantic palaces, whereas Rome is filled with various structures, really for public entertainment, is probably the most characteristic building type of imperial Rome. So they look very different, and one might therefore conclude, well, they're just very different cities. My argument in this paper was that though they look different on the surface, they both nevertheless serve as kind of expressions, built up monumentalized visions of an underlying monarchic ideal, which on the Chinese side is a little bit more kind of awe-imposing, and autocratic might not be the right word. Michael not the right word, but maybe a little bit more distant and ritualized. Whereas Roman emperors, partly because they come out of that republican tradition, have an expectation to be highly visible and participatory in the city. And it turns out that these venues of public entertainment are the best ways to express that. So I tried to think in this piece about what the palaces might say about Chinese monarchic ideology, and what the public entertainment buildings for gladiatorial combat or horse racing, for example, might say about Roman monarchic ideology. And the ideologies are themselves a little bit different, but the built-up expression of them, I think, both respond to those underlying demands.
Yeah, if I were to add to that, and I'll try to add to that very briefly, I completely agree with Carlos's analysis, and what I would say is we're dealing with very different traditions, a movement from republican traditions to imperial. In Han Chang'an, a need to lend authority to a commoner who has no background, no natural allies. And so the city is meant to impress because that's the only way he can gain allies. And so I think that when you look at what precedes the period we focused on, that would be one striking contrast. The other striking contrast that I think has to be put on the table almost immediately is that due to earlier thinkers' visions of what would be good governance on the North China Plain, the Han has an enormous administration, 130,000 officials, 30,000 of whom live in the capital. And that ends up, because these officials also had staffs, in saying there is one official paid by the government for about every 50 people. Okay. Under Augustus, and I would never have known this really because people don't focus on these things in the literature, or tend to focus on them. Augustus has 0 paid administrators. I mean, I might have gleaned this from some of my work reading Latin classics, but But really, he sends his friends out. They liaise with local elites who then together ensure that taxes and tribute come to Rome. Of course, the Han Empire is dependent on taxes and tribute, but they spend far more of their budget on what I would call civil activities, including processions, including bridge building, including all kinds of activities for the populace. But they have a very different vision of what the implicit social contract is. The Han administration is not only to keep the peace, in return for which people will give them taxes and tribute. They are to civilize, educate, and protect the disadvantaged. And that means an enormous part of their budget is almost like a proto-welfare state. They make free loans to the populace. They take care of the aged. They take care of orphans. They have much, much different ideas about what constitutes good governance and what must be done lest the population rebel against the capital and court. So
this leads well into the next question that I have for you, Michael, which is that in the book of which this conversation is based, Chang'an 26 BCE, you write that, quote, in all likelihood, the Western Han capital of Chang'an could not have attracted the quantity and quality of sites and artifacts we find there today had three factors not been in place well before Chengdi's reign in the 26 years. One is a good highway system, which had been built by Chengdi's predecessors during the Qin in 221 to 210 BCE and Western Han. Two, an immense effective bureaucracy, which administered the capital commanderies. Three, a knowledge of production and methods of silk and lacquer to the two coveted luxury items that largely underwrote the throne's initiatives for centuries, end quote. I'd like to juxtapose this with this quote with another from the same article in which you write, quote, surprisingly little work has gone into reconstructing any aspect of urban life in Western Han Chang'an, perhaps because wooden architecture and rammed earth foundations have left few enduring traces, end quote. And you actually do have a picture in that book of this big dirt mound. And for an untrained eye like me, I would not be able to tell that that was a former wall. Yes. But my question is, if you could phrase into just a few bullet points, what specific aspects of Western Han Chang'an's urban life, culture, architecture, etc., do you wish we could know more about, either realistically or maybe just sort of as a fantasy, like we'll never truly know, but you would like to know?
Okay, I'm going to backtrack a little bit because I'd like to make the first quotation that you cited lead to the second. Mark Elvin, who was a first-rate social historian, wrote a beautiful little essay called Empires and Their Size. And basically, he stated the obvious, but boy, he stated it so that we can really know it. The primary problem that empires have in antiquity is how do you transport goods and how do you communicate with far-flung places, okay? And he gave for Han a fabulous figure, a single figure that we have, that to transport a cart of grain basically 100 miles from the capital cost 192 times the value of the grain. Now that would be just like Rome, which is getting a lot of its grain from Egypt because you can put it on ships and that's the cheapest and best way to transport things. So all Chinese capitals are built on water. I believe that's true of all antique capitals. And they all need to pay most attention to transportation and communication. Then how do they get On what basis do they get taxes and tribute, i.e. wealth and resources? And then how are they going to distribute it wisely, i.e. in a way that the populace will say, this benefits me, okay? So that's why I say they had to have had in place for a 1.2 tax-paying residents in the Chang'an area, good transportation and communication. Already they had to have had for the empire at large a vast administration of highly trained experts, helping them communicate local problems to the capital, helping them decide what wise policies will we put in place so that we can redistribute this wealth in a way that will prove pleasing to the populace. What they can't afford is a local rebellion that would require all of their money and men. And when we think about what advantage did they have, how did they get such an advantage? They didn't have the Mediterranean, which is absolutely an advantage to organize an empire where many parts of it can be gotten to easily by boats. What they had was two superior technologies, and that was silk making and lacquer making. We don't think about lacquer because a lot of us don't use it in our daily lives. It was the elite plastic of the ancient world, okay? You could put things like wine in it and they would not spoil, okay? Everybody wants lacquer. But what everybody wants even more is silk. Silk was being sold to Roman elites, okay? Since they were the only country that had the technology at the time, they could make incredible, they had a monopoly. They could make incredible amounts of money on the silk trade, even though part of that silk trade as it comes closer to Rome is carried out by middlemen, okay, who then tack on higher and higher prices. Okay, so if this is such a great capital, and I think it was, how come we don't have evidence of it, or not so much evidence of it? Well, we have a great deal of evidence, but because they built in wood, we don't have what you have in Rome. I can go to Rome today and go to the Colosseum, or I can go to a Mithraic temple, as I frequently do. No problem. They built in wood, so that's gone. What we have is rammed earth foundations and basically post holes where the timbers were placed in them for wooden architecture. So unless you are an archaeologist, none of this reads like anything to you. And so what have we got? Well, we've got a couple of things, and here's where I would start. Both of our empires, the vast majority of people have limited to no literacy, okay? So the Romans have made a great deal of the fact that they believe their empire could not have been held together had it not been faces of emperors on coins and Roman statues in the marketplace. Well, as far as we know, in fact, there's an amusing anecdote in one of the Han histories where someone says, hey, that guy of a pretty impressive empire over there, and he means Rome, puts his face on the coins. And the emperor said, why would he want to be fingered by every Tom, Dick, and Harry? I mean, it just seems mystifying to a Chinese emperor. So one of the things I'd love to know, and I have a hypothesis about it, but it will probably never be anything more than a hypothesis. What signified governmental authority, political authority to them? And I have a feeling that every government building was marked with roof tiles on the end of this distinctive gray tiled roof, and that those were all decorated with auspicious symbols and also with Chinese writing, auspicious sayings. And I have a feeling that that marked governmental authority. But I simply won't know, because Han coins are as boring as you can make them. They're round with a square hole in the middle. That signifies the round cosmos, the square earth, and they were strung together by the hundreds. Okay. So we're not looking at coins for images of emperors. We're not looking at Han Chang'an for statuary, because although there was monumental statuary, most of it seems to have been dedicated to the dead, to underground armies, as a replacement for above ground living armies. Those are the famous Terracotta Warriors of the Qing period. There are their equivalent in the Han period, many, many thousands buried around an emperor's tomb, smaller in size, but clothed in brilliantly embroidered silks. And we know that because little scraps of the silk is still archaeologically retrievable. And so these probably cost more than the Terracotta Warriors, though they're a third of the size. What's also really interesting is their sex organs are perfectly articulated, okay? Though once everyone was wearing robes, really, and everyone had long hair pulled back. So it would have been very difficult to distinguish male and female. Why was it important in burying these objects to so carefully indicate sex? And does it tell us anything about gender? Okay, that's the first thing I'd like to know. I'm a gender historian, and I'd really like to have the answer for that. And another thing I'd like to know is, only in the Chang'an area has the density of archaeological excavation taken us all the way down to middle class and lower middle class tombs. And we can begin to tabulate these tombs. And I believe we can begin to posit a middle class aesthetic that was quite a bit different from the imperial aesthetic. The middle class aesthetic was not about vast banquets. It was not about hunting parties. It was not about palatial living. The middle class aesthetic focused on mother, child, almost exclusively, as indication of the hearth. And the grave goods in the objects, the grave goods in the tombs were quite a bit different than the grave goods. They weren't just cheap imitations of the grave goods in the royal and imperial tombs. Okay. So I'm become very interested in, there's so many of these tombs, 20,000. It will take me the rest of my life to even begin to tabulate the information I have at my fingertips. But I'm beginning to at least try to work on the first 200 or 300 of them and see, can I posit a discrete aesthetic for what the Chinese calls literally middle class in ancient writings. They are aware of a middle class, and they have quite a developed, for the antique world, middle class. So I'd really like to know that. And I'm almost finished with the things I'd like to know first. In Rome, Rome was pretty much the only game in town. I mean, there were a few, Athens, Alexandria, but nothing like Rome. In the Han Empire, there were 5 other metropolitan hubs of antiquity, enormously wealthy, enormously populous. And I'd like to know how all of those interacted with each other. And so I've begun to do work on what is another hub of activity called Loyang, to try to do extensive work on the interactions specifically of Chang'an and Loyang, because this becomes the corridor of power for 1,000 years. Capitals alternating between Chang'an and Loyang. One dynasty after another. Chang'an was capital for 16 dynasties. So this is pretty impressive. People want to go back to this over and over again. I'm sure I've used up my time.
You're all good. Professor Noreña, thinking back to Rome, but in a slightly different way of thinking about it, based on your research, in what ways has Rome's engineering, architecture, urban planning, etc., been more advanced than that of Western Han Chang'an, and in what ways did these aspects of Western Han Chang'an outshine Rome?
I'm a little wary of the framing of the question, only because that can lead to, facile rankings between this or that culture or civilization or history. And I think I'm feeling maybe more sensitive to that than somebody on the China side would do, because there's been a lot of internal critique in my field, in my scholarship, about one of the so-called pitfalls of comparative work, that it serves almost deviously as yet another way to center Greece and Rome as the paradigm to which everything else that is being compared necessarily falls short. Now, that's not an approach that I take, but some of those who have critiqued comparative investigations that have Greece and Rome as one component have been worried about that issue. I realize you weren't framing the question that way, but sometimes that way of thinking can lead down that path. Let me say that, as a basic matter of logistics that Michael's already touched on, both cities are breathtaking accomplishments. To sustain populations of that size, right around the 1 million inhabitant mark, with the technologies that were available in a pre-modern economy. Michael cites this famous observation by Mark Elvin about the cost of overland transport. We have this similar version of this, which is that in the world of the Roman Empire, it cost more money to ship goods 50 miles over land than it did to ship that same goods from one end of the Mediterranean to the other, just several thousand miles in length. So this points to the much greater efficiencies of waterborne transport that certainly underpin a lot of the trade in goods in the Roman Empire generally, but that also enable the sustaining of a population of that size. I mean, I think when people point to the impressive building accomplishments of ancient Rome, some of these are in fact to do with these kinds of questions of maintenance of a large population. So one might look, for example, to the aqueducts. From an early date, Rome's population far outstripped natural water supplies, which include rainfall, the Tiber River, and wells. So they needed to start bringing in water from outside in order to make this population possible. So the aqueducts are this quite remarkable technology that really works on the principle of gravity to bring water in from huge distances. The Romans didn't have a tap technology, so they couldn't turn the water off that came in, but then they used the off-flow to flush out their underground sewage system, which is also often pointed to as a kind of tremendous accomplishment of urban engineering. A lot of what makes all of that possible, both the aqueducts and the underground sewage, is a building technology and a set of materials that are just not available in the same way in the North China Plain. And I'm thinking both of stone, but also in particular of cement. There's been a lot of interesting work recently on what has been called the Roman cement revolution, which begins to make an impact on the city of Rome in the middle of the 2nd century BCE, so a little bit earlier than what I focused on in my first answer. But cement turned out to be something very easy to produce in large quantities, and it could then serve as the foundations, literally, of gigantic structures with huge vaulted ceilings that not only gave ancient Rome its kind of distinctive urban aesthetic, but has survived in mostly intact to the present day in ways that are not true of the wood-based and rammed earth architecture of Chang'an. Now, it's interesting that historians, of course, were sensitive to this, but for the general public or the tourists, they're going to think that Rome is far more impressive because they can literally see it in ways that, ancient Chang'an is now invisible. But I think, without necessarily going into a kind of more or less advanced, it's the availability of this building material in particular, concrete, which the Romans were masters of. And they often supplemented this with brick. Brickwork was another important building technology. And often the two together. Brick-faced concrete is the kind of building style par excellence for ancient Rome. And it enables a kind of both infrastructural and monumental grandeur that is impressive to the visitor to the 2022, to the current day.
And I forgot to ask the second part of that question. If you were to think about the work that's been done in Roman archaeology, what would be 1 or 2 bullet points of something that you would like to see, hopefully, in your lifetime?
It's a great question. And in a way, my field's already had a revolution in interest that I think has been very productive, which is to turn away from the grand buildings and the monuments and the emperors, and to try to get down to a more granular level of what we sometimes call daily life in ancient cities. So there's been a lot of interesting work on domestic space, residential architecture, streets, low-level commercial traffic, that sort of thing. I'd like to see even more of that. There's an interesting new development in sensory archaeology. And we're spending a lot more time thinking about not just the sites, but the soundscapes of the ancient city, the smells, the tactile experience of the city, marble, stone, brick, open air, that kind of combination of things, and trying to think a little bit about the experience, even at the psychological level of moving around in this great megalopolis, which is a project that's been really enhanced and furthered by revolutions in digital technology. So we now have some really quite impressive digital reconstructions, 3-dimensional reconstructions of urban space. And these, I think, this is a real game changer, both for students, but also for serious scholarship, to imagine the experience of being in the city. So I think we're just on the cusp of real breakthroughs in that area.
So I'd like to shift the conversation a little bit, leading to a question for you, Michael, shifting the conversation to thinking a little bit about the politics/philosophy of history. China is unique in that it claims a multimillennial history. However, the notion of China is a modern conceptualization, and at least in the way that we use the term and understand it today. And the people living in Han Chang'an would not necessarily have conceived themselves as being Chinese. Some people that I've spoken with, and I've had a lot of philosophical conversations and debates about this idea. And so I'd like to get your thoughts on this. Some people I've spoken with have argued that talking about China as having a multimillennial history is sort of a part of this larger political agenda by the current government that's in power, for things like territorial claims over certain ethnic groups, et cetera. I wanted to get your view on this and see, is it still a useful category to be talking about the Han Dynasty as being a part of Chinese history, or should we think of it as being a separate history, or just sort of for convenience sake, is it easy to just say, well, I study Chinese history? What are your thoughts on
that? My thoughts are, as a historian, that of course these concepts have a history themselves. And the history was when the Qing Dynasty fell in 1911, many people in the area we identify today as China began to say, how do we compare with other world civilizations? And they saw that their earliest writing came from a time period that was the New Kingdom, not the Old Kingdom, in Egypt. And so they began to articulate, because they wanted their fellow citizens to be able to take pride in their heritage as a modern nation state with aspirations to a dignified place in the world order, they began saying, well, we certainly can't lay claim to the oldest civilization. That would be Mesopotamia, probably. I mean, people would have different ideas how far we could go back there. But we can say we've had the oldest continuous civilization, because since 1300 BC, pretty recognizable, not by the non-expert, but by the expert, evolution of graphic forms, script, to convey the language. So there's been a lot of focus on the continuity of Chinese script. As a historian, I'd have to say, anybody who's looking carefully would have to note that there's a lot of discontinuity. It's not easy to read oracle bone script from 1300 BC if you can read modern script. And people in the Han Dynasty, when there was an earthquake and things emerged from the soil, old bronzes or old bones with writing on them, they couldn't decipher them. They simply couldn't do that. That's one of the projects that begins in Chengdi's reign with this group of polymaths serving the emperor. They decide they're going to try to decipher the ancient script. And so eventually they do it. It takes them about 100 years of nonstop work, but eventually they do it. This has a political history behind it, the oldest continuous civilization. And under recent regimes, there has been a state-sponsored research group that tries to prove the historicity of the Xia dynasty, which would put things pushed easily to 3000 BC. Okay. And of course, why are they pushing? They wish to get a bit more street cred, if you will, in the world for being such a magnificent civilization from very early on. Nonetheless, there is no writing from that period, and the arguments that have been made about proto-writing make no sense to anyone who is a linguist and knows how languages evolve, okay? But they're right in saying in 1300 BC, the language is fully formed. The grammar is quite available to someone like me to read, no special training needed. Okay, so yes, the Chinese language acquired a few bells and whistles over time, but basically this is true. And that language we're seeing on oracle bones didn't come from nowhere. Okay, so it came, there were precursors to it, probably on perishable materials. Okay. So on the one hand, we can push back, we scholars of the West, against bogus arguments for which there is no credible evidence. And on the other hand, if we understand this as an expression of legitimate aspirations for China to be given a bit more respect on the world stage, then I think we don't let this bother us. We simply say, no, this is not credible, and we move on, okay? So I have to teach early China, and I'll recommend a book to everyone. There's a new book by a guy named Xin Fan, which shows the difficulty the Communist Party had in retrofitting Marxian linear modes of history, linear schema of history to Chinese history. They don't fit at all, okay? And that was the Communist Party project, to somehow make these make sense, though they're irreconcilable, okay? And so what emerged in a series of extremely messy conversations that lasted 15 years was a specific way of talking about ancient Chinese history, or early China, as I call it, that allowed people to both not discredit the Marxian schema, but take into account some realities of the distant Chinese past. And so I'll give you an example. One of the things that's come out of Carlos, my cooperation with Carlos, is we've thought a lot about literacy rates. And this is not an exact science. It will never be an exact science, but we would expect higher rates of urbanization to correlate with at least rudimentary literacy. And because we've got such a big bureaucracy here, where people to some degree for some of those positions were competing on the basis of their high cultural literacy, acquisition thereof, there was a real impetus to become literate in this empire. In Greece and Rome, many slaves were more literate than some masters. That would not be the case in Han China. And we can imagine, if not prove, that literacy would have been much more widely spread in this empire. And so I think this focus on continuous Chinese script can be seen in the archaeology. It can be seen in the kinds of projects that Chinese historians focus on, what they value. And I think the big difference, if we're going to talk about a divide in scholarship, is that Euro-American scholars of China, we're not patriotically invested in this story. And so we're very interested in things that don't strike many Chinese historians as glorious at all. I worked a lot on sewage. I worked a lot on canal building, convicts cemeteries. You know, I'm interested in a lot of things that are not contributions to the glorious continuous civilization of China. But I think in the end, with good scholars, East and West, our work complements each other. We don't have to buy everything that they say, and they don't have to buy every interest of ours. But in both countries, the best scholars are talking to each other all the time and trying to make a picture that's coherent of the past. I've been very influenced by a French famous historian called Paul Vane. And what he said is historians in the past used to think that they were making a story about cause and effect. What historians of the present day think they're doing, or at least what I think I'm doing, is trying to make a plausible reconstruction of at least the silhouette of the past. So some of the colors will be missing. For Han Chang'an, we'll never be able to do some of the color work and some of the smell work that is easily done when you've got permanent buildings. That's what you need. I've worked in digital humanities enough to know you need this type of thing to anchor your research. We won't have that. But what historians such as ourselves can do is really add color and texture to the pictures of the Chinese past that we have been given by our Chinese counterparts.
So thinking about this question in the same vein, it also has a little bit of a connection to me, because I come from Italian ancestry, and so when I was writing this question for you, Professor Noreña, I was thinking about that. So my question is, it seems as though it would be politically useful for the Italian government to talk about themselves as also having a multimillennial history like China. However, in my experience, not only talking to my relatives, talking to my late grandfather, spending time in Italy, the notion of Italy as being multimillennial does not seem to be as pronounced as that in China. Can you talk maybe a little bit about why that's the case? Or maybe I'm just completely wrong in understanding the way that it's talked about or thought of in Italy.
No, you're quite right. There is a difference here. I'm tempted to begin with a provocation, namely that Italy is a fiction. Italy is a fabrication. Italy is something we exist in the world of the imagination. And by that I mean the history that has transpired on the peninsula in the middle of the Mediterranean that we call Italy is highly varied and fragmented. This is a point I make when I'm introducing ancient Rome to the students. There comes a point in Roman history when we can talk very confidently about Rome and Italy. And we all can speak about Italy as a modern country and a culture. We all know what we're talking about. But in fact, just beneath the surface is a high degree of fragmentation. Whether we are speaking geographically or geologically, or going back to antiquity, ethnically, linguistically, culturally, it's a very diversified space. And the notion that there exists a single Italy is often a product of ideology. In antiquity, under the Romans, who wanted to promote a sense of a homogeneous, unified Italy, and up to a point even in the modern period. I mean, the modern nation state of Italy is, in historical perspective, extremely young. I mean, it is first proclaimed, as you know, in 1861, and takes its something like its final shape in 1871. So we're talking about the second half of the 19th century that Italy as such exists. So it's a very recent phenomenon. And anybody who has spent any time in Italy will, of course, have experienced in an almost visceral way the remarkable diversity of the place we call Italy. To go from Milan to Rome to Naples to Sicily is to inhabit 4 different universes. Now, that said, there have, of course, been phases in the later history, the modern history of Italy, in which appeals to a continuous past have been made. most famously in the fascist era under Mussolini, when there was a self-conscious and quite aggressive effort undertaken to attach the ambitions of the fascist government to the achievements as they were then understood of the Roman Empire. So there came a moment when that multimillennial history was very much alive and very resonant. And I think in the time since then, we can sort of trace fluctuations in the degree to which the peoples of Italy, the government of Italy, taps into that deep history that has played out on its soil. But I think we always have to remember it's in fact a deeply fragmented history and landscape that one could say can only be thought of as a continuous history from a pretty ideologically focused program.
Yeah, if I can jump in there. When Carlos and I are teaching together, he ends with the empire, still speaking of the Roman Empire, when actually there are two capitals of it, and one is over in Byzantium. And to me, that's a shock. So we have eternal Rome, and the fascination with that spawned before I decided to write Chang'an. At that point, 7,600 books, more or less, on eternal Rome and all of that. We had 0 on Han Chang'an at the same time, okay? So what does this tell you? Han Chang'an built the greatest library of the antique world, but everybody knows Alexandria, okay? So we're all dealing with cultures that at points really want to look to the past and make claims in their ideology to having a firm foundation in the distant past. Okay? The founding fathers of America looked to the Roman Republic, not to Greece, but the Roman Republic as their model. So there is a kind of enduring eternal Rome, many portraits thereof, and many of them in conflict. And one of the interesting things about Chang'an is, boy, even people who are Chinese know almost nothing about Han Chang'an, though it was 16 times a capital. And during the Han period had 1.2 million people. Ask the man on the street, tell me about Han Chang'an. Total silence. Okay. And so what I would say is that if you have been to the modern city that is now occupying part of what used to be Han Chang'an metropolitan area, that would be modern Xi'an. And you go to any of its museums, you'll see thousands of objects and a pretty complete recreation of Tang Chang'an, which was a separate city in the same area as Han Chang'an, all in the same small basin, but not the same city. Sometimes even China experts don't know that Han Chang'an is not Tang Chang'an, and there's only a little corner that overlaps because there's been an extraordinary explosion of interest in Tang Chang'an. Why? Because people can go to this completely built, rebuilt, reconstructed, absolutely on a good archaeological basis of the old palaces of Tang Chang'an. Also, people are interested in the Silk Road, and they know how it operated in Tang Chang'an, but they haven't really quite understood how it operated in Han. And part of the reason they haven't understood how it operated is there were about 15 Silk Roads. Some of them were maritime, some of them were riverine, some of them were across Central Asia. So this has been more complex and difficult to reconstruct. But anyway, here we are in the business of this reconstruction. So I think the Chinese government, with all its focus on the longest continuous civilization, has done a pretty bad job of teaching its own populace about history. And part of that is for ideological reasons, but part of it is the early histories produced in the 1920s and 30s were pretty much patriotic outpourings by non-professional historians. And there was good history being done. And I sometimes look on Google how many people are citing these patriotic texts versus the really impressive scholars of the period. And I can tell you the really impressive scholars are being cited a lot less often.
So for this next question, we're going to talk about something that can also be kind of contentious, but thinking about it here in the US. And, before I ask this question, I do want to let the audience know, like I don't believe in trick questions or gotcha questions. So both of our guests here today were aware of the question I am going to ask prior to this interview. So it's not like a gotcha question or anything. But with that being said, I'm just going to read verbatim what I'd written here for my question. So I read, my next question is going to touch on a bit of politics here in the US. When people think about a university like UC Berkeley, one thought that tends to come to many people's minds is that Berkeley is a very left-leaning university. Of course, most universities tend to, quote unquote, lean left in terms of the way that the students and faculty see and engage with the world around them. However, Berkeley tends to stand out among people as being especially left-leaning. In my observations and experiences, it seems that this perception regarding universities such as Berkeley has had some negative impact on the ability of China scholars, at least in the field that I've engaged with, but perhaps other scholars, to communicate to general audiences. So, for example, I'm currently reading a book by a professor at UC Berkeley, and I was recently talking with someone I know who tends to lean more on the conservative side about this book and the compelling arguments that the author is making. Instead of being met with a sense of intrigue by this person, he had responded with a comment, something to the effect of, "Hey, be careful. I don't trust what the liberals at these universities have to say these days," despite the fact that this person had never read the book and had never heard of this professor prior to our conversation. It was disheartening to me because I personally respect this professor and the research that this person has conducted for the book. Now, to be clear, while this person was what we'd call right-leaning, I'm by no means saying that all conservative people immediately eschew what professors have to say about their research. But that said, it seems evident, at least to me, that among the conservative base in the US, there is a growing population of people who distrust what professionals in universities have to say. This distrust is exacerbated, for example, by some right-wing guest speakers having their scheduled lectures canceled by students at UC Berkeley. I'm not going to weigh in on whether or not I think their actions are justified or not. There are far smarter people than myself who can talk about these political issues. The only point that I mean to make is that examples such as these seem to fuel resentment and distrust by these people of our academic institutions and the scholars who work in them. The growing distrust concerns me because we can look, for example, at the last presidential election, which demonstrated how many people tend to lean right in their political views, with Trump having received 74 million votes in the 2020 election. I want to be clear that this does not concern me because of the fact that these people are conservative. I'm always personally open to having conversations with a diversity of people around me. Rather, my worry is that in the distrust of this population of people who distrust scholars, including scholars of China or maybe scholars of Italy, what they say, they'll elect people, they'll elect political officials who similarly distrust our research. However, I want to be clear, this isn't to say that all of the people on the political left actively listen to what we have to say either. I'm almost done with the question. Especially as conversations about China have, particularly in the past couple of years, entered in the realm of popular political discussion. It is important that the general public, both conservatives and liberals alike, receive sound and thoughtful information about China from reliable sources and people who have dedicated their lives to the pursuit of this field of study. Electing and subsequently following the words of political officials who do not have a firm understanding of China, its views, its politics, etc., in my view, could have disastrous political effects. I think that this growing distrust comes, at least in part, from a sense of elitism that a small minority, and I do want to emphasize small minority, of professors carry, in that they look down upon people who understand the world in a different light than they do. To be clear, I do truly believe that the overwhelming majority of professors who I've interacted with are kind and humble toward all people, no matter their background or political orientation. Nevertheless, I think that the stereotype of the quote unquote elitist professor has pervaded the minds of many Americans. Although it's the case that in a dialogue, it's incumbent upon the party being imparted information to be open-minded to new arguments and ideas, it's equally incumbent, in my view, for people who possess the knowledge being conveyed to continuously find new and innovative ways to make persuasive arguments that demonstrate their ideas effectively, rather than simply dismissing the other party as not getting it or being too foolish. So with that said, how can scholars of China for you, Michael, or just scholars of history in general, in the wake of an increasingly politicized environment, more effectively reach out to the public, especially to those who look at us as with suspicion as harboring a political agenda?
Well, first of all, I want to say I teach courses on the politics of the common good, both in China and elsewhere. And I'm sponsoring in the month of March a series called In Dialogue with China. But what I'd like to do, and Carlos has graciously yielded me the floor to begin because I have an MA in American history. What I'd like to do is remind people that since the time of Ronald Reagan, it has been a consistent propaganda point, if you will, that universities are elitist ivory tower idiots. Ronald Reagan was on film saying that Berkeley was nothing but queers and communists, and he tried to defund public education. Nattering nabobs of negativity is what Spiro Agnew had to say about us. Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney said, oh, these poor, pathetic university people, they study reality. They're reality-based. We make reality, okay? So there has been a pretty consistent attack on universities as elitist. I'd like to remind everybody who might be listening to this, but Berkeley is a public university. And we are proud to teach here because it is a public university. And I teach a lot of people whose parents didn't get past primary school, okay? So we have a very diverse population here. What we're trying to do is train them for the future. I'd also like to distinguish something that we knew very clearly in the aftermath or during the Vietnam War, that a government can be engaging in policies we don't admire, and we don't blacken the people who are under that government. Okay, so it's easy for me to talk about the glories of the legacy to which the current population in China is heir, okay? At the same time that I may disagree with government policies in China. And it's easy for me to work with people I disagree with politically, and who are not like myself in their presuppositions. I make that, I don't see how I could become a good scholar if I were not willing to hear voices that don't coincide with those in my head. I think, and then I'm going to let Carlos jump in, every profession has jerks who are pulling rank, okay? I see them in business, I see them in the university. I don't think we have a larger proportion of them at Berkeley. I think that the people I meet, by and large, are here to try to make better sense of the world. I forget who said it, but someone said if you were studying fish, you'd have to observe fish. If you're studying human beings, you need to do it in a methodical way, okay? And that's what we're engaged in at Berkeley, in what the French call the human sciences. That's what a liberal arts education is all about. I would make one minor correction to your historical account, which is that political speakers on the right were shut down by students. The sponsoring group for many of these lecturers knew that the university was spending about $2 million for each lecturer who came to campus for security. And many people in that group said, the university, we should bankrupt it. We don't like it. It's a mill for liberal ideas. Of course, the reason why many people at the university vote Democratic is we're reality-based. We simply study the patterns in world history and say, what's likely to happen if these series of factors are in alignment? Okay, so I think that's why it's not group speak. We disagree about all kinds of things. In fact, Berkeley is famously portrayed over and over again as faculty members fighting over ideas, fighting about the best course of action, fighting about this. We're not looking for consensus. We're looking to test ideas in real life here. Carlos, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with what you've said. Seems to me that there has long been a streak in American culture that is skeptical towards or even hostile towards expertise of any kind, which I do think experienced a bit of an uptick from the Reagan era, from the 80s, and a slightly different configuration of the Republican Party that has made universities, I think, a target of partisan politics. And in some ways, we're an obvious target. I think a lot of the politics of the last generation can be explained by a lot of the dislocations that have come about through globalization and the disappearance of an old kind of manufacturing economy that underpinned our social stability for several generations prior. And I think a lot of people are hurting and suffering. And I think my read on a lot of the conservative attacks on the university is that they're effectively tapping into that pain and anxiety. And the system as an abstraction makes a good target because the system isn't working for a lot of people. And universities are a kind of high-profile expression, I think, in many people's minds of what that system is. So that's my sort of basically agreeing with Michael. Is my sort of version on how we've gotten to this place. I do believe that there should be more space and place on campuses for a wider range of viewpoints than is normally on offer. But I also agree with Michael that these very high-profile incidents in recent years of right-wing speakers at Berkeley being canceled, many of them were on record saying that the whole point was to get canceled so that we could make an issue out of it.
And to bankrupt the university.
And that too.
Yeah.
Now this represents, I mean, this is a perennial problem in political thought. This represents a challenge to liberal thinking and open-mindedness. That does that liberal thinking and progressive open-mindedness extend even to those who would destroy it? Mm-hmm. And that's really, in some ways, a tricky problem and maybe an insoluble one. But yeah, I mean,
But I think we do. For example, the person who wrote the torture memo for
that's true.
The Iraq War, there was never any mass movement to get him off the faculty.
Right.
We believe he should be allowed to speak. Right. Whether he should be allowed to have a law degree or should be disbarred is a different issue. But on campus, we have many voices that I bet Carlos and I would not agree with.
Of course, but we both value their presence here so that we can sharpen our own disagreements with them.
Yes,
and become better thinkers.
So I think we both feel that the charges against a liberal arts education are somewhat ill-informed, anecdotal, characterizing what's actually going on. I was there as an observer with an armband simply to try to keep the peace when there were potentially violent protests. And I was there with one of my students who's trained, has a law degree. So he was trained to do on-the-spot legal counseling for someone who was in problem. Either side, just if trouble arose. We were there to keep the peace. So I think I'm not alone. I think there are quite a lot of people like us. So I think we're not a good scapegoat because in America, as someone in Europe reminded me, what they regard as the prime support for social mobility is that they give healthcare to all, and a degree of education to all, but a lower degree of education. They expect that far less of their population will receive BA degrees, graduate from college or university, let alone advanced degrees. And our mode in America has always been historically that we would educate more people and educate them well. And we can actually only have universities as engines of social mobility if the general public supports this. Yeah. It's very plain. We're not the Ivies. We don't have deep pockets. We are the #1 public university, probably in the world, usually voted to be so. Why is that so? It's because we have incredible diversity here, and we have incredible ambitions here to try and make sense of the world, past, present, and sometimes even future, at this university. So I'm a big believer. I came from an elite institution, private. I loved it. It was Bryn Mawr Women's College, one of the Seven Sisters, but I was ecstatic about coming to work at Berkeley for a first-rate public institution with some of the greatest libraries in the world. But I don't spend much time in the library. I'm out there teaching my classes, running from one activity to another. So I just want to say this is a great institution, and I feel that people have really misconstrued what goes on here. Just because I studied China doesn't mean I particularly have one stance or another. And I grew up in Kentucky on a farm. I'm a very complicated human being, pockets of real conservatism, and probably real out there leftist politics. And I bet a lot of people on campus are this complex mix of ideas because they've had a complex mix of experiences. So we don't lean left or lean right. We try, the best of us, to look at each problem on its own and follow the evidence where it leads us.
Well, I want to thank you too for having that conversation with me. And one of the reasons that I did ask that question was because I do want to show anyone who's watching this video, like, hey, look, you're not going to be canceled for having these conversations.
I've never canceled anybody or been canceled by anybody. Yeah.
Well, I want to end our interview on a little bit lighter of a note here. One conceptualization that people tend to have about early history, ancient history, is like, well, if it's not modern, it doesn't really matter. Who cares? If you could just give a short elevator pitch, what about early history matters? How can it inspire us? How can it make us better people? I guess, Professor Noreña, I could start with you, if you could just give a few thoughts to that.
Yeah, of course, it's something we think about a lot. I have really two ways to answer it. One is by the analogy of a sporting event or a movie or a book. None of the three of which things anybody in their right mind would want to start in the middle of. If you go to a game or watch a movie or read a book, you want to start from the beginning so that you can know the whole story. So I believe that this is relevant on the biggest scale of the history of man and humankind. And so we should go back to the beginning to have a sense of where we are now today in time and space. That's one answer. The other one runs in a little bit different direction. I think history in general, but ancient history in particular, is very good at defamiliarization. One of the things I really want to help students to do is to shake them out of a kind of lazy and poorly thought out belief that the world around them is somehow inevitable or natural, when it's not at all. It's the product of a historical process that has brought us to this place, and many other outcomes were possible, and many other futures are therefore still possible. In ancient history, because it's so alien and different, can help to kind of awaken students to some of the oddnesses of the present. And in that regard, it's precisely not the continuity from the past, but the difference of the past, the alienness of the past, that makes it, of the ancient past, that makes it such a useful laboratory for thinking. And also, this is probably more true on my side than on Michael's, but it becomes a kind of a safe space because it's so far away, because the implications are so tenuous for the present. It becomes a useful place to think about hot button issues like race, ethnicity, sex, violence, slavery, because you can talk about them from a safe remove from the concerns of the present. And therefore, it's a good place to think through issues that are very relevant to the present day, but in this kind of safely isolated or siloed context.
I guess if I'm going to say why I'm an ancient historian, I began studying Mao Zedong and just kept going. I can't make sense of this unless I go back further. Too much of the discourse relates to things I just don't know enough about. For me, I think as a Southerner, of the famous saying by William Faulkner, the past isn't dead, it isn't even past. Okay, and as a Southerner, we see that. Ideas about the past that should, by all rights, have died a long time ago, are alive and well in the present day. And because we read, we can get new ideas from the past all the time. I read Julius Caesar. How am I going to make sense of it in terms of modern times? So we're still reading Julius Caesar. We're still reading all kinds of materials that are not from the present age. What I think of is that part of this discounting of expert knowledge says that we live in the best of all possible worlds, and we are the end product of inevitable forces. And what we are concerned with showing is no, people have thought differently about key issues in the past, which means as human beings, we can forge a better future than we will do if we keep along exactly the same path. We know that people are path dependent, meaning it actually takes extra energy to rethink an issue. Our bodies are not made to do that kind of rethinking. And so if we're going to think ourselves out of a number of current predicaments, I think we need to go to the past to defamiliarize the present, as Carlos would say, and then begin to rethink some of these issues from the ground up. So I'm totally committed to the past because I'm totally committed to the present. And I'm supposedly an expert in 20th century China as well. I tend to talk about the use and abuse of the past, but I don't only talk about the use and the abuse of the past. I talk about how do archaeologists do their work in China? How do people today see the ancient past? Why is it important for them? It doesn't seem to be so important for Americans to see themselves as heirs to a distinguished tradition. I would say traditions, because what we know about China was mutually unintelligible languages throughout imperial history and into the modern present. That may be why there's so much focus on the script, because people could only communicate by writing things down to each other. So anyway, I think Carlos and I are very committed to living in two experiential worlds and trying to make sense of them by tacking back and forth between two very different experiential worlds.
Well, I just want to say it's an honor to have two esteemed Berkeley professors on my small insignificant podcast. So really thank you both for taking the time to talk to me.
I think we both want to thank you for reaching out to us and beginning a certain kind of conversation. So thank you.
Our pleasure.
Yeah.
Our pleasure. Thanks, Dakota.
Our pleasure.
And for those who want to see more content, you can go to the What is Asia podcast YouTube channel or NakotaDefonda.com. We'll see you in the next episode.